I'm Alice Lesman, the Director of Housing Information and Referral Service, which is part of the Office of Work Life. There's a lot of information on our website, worklife.columbia.edu, that pertains not only just to housing, but also to my colleagues and the work that they do, which covers wellness, schooling, childcare, and we also have a benefit that should be available to most postdocs for backup care. All of the eligibility regarding backup care, which is both for children that need care, or that are 12 or under, and if you have elderly parents, that can cover their care as well for emergency purposes. It's all explained on our website, how to enroll in it. It is really a great benefit, but it is with an outside vendor. Eligibility needs to be confirmed by them, from them to Columbia. But it's definitely something to check out if you think you might need it. I'm going to base this entire presentation off of the rental guide that is on our website. So if you can, it probably would be helpful for you to pull that up, because the entire thing is based in sequential order from that rental guide. So there's a lot in that rental guide. It's 23 pages. So I'm going to basically condense it down to the things that are most important and should be highlighted. But there's a lot more information than what I'm going to say that's in there. There's also a moving guide for when you move on the website. That's something to be aware of. Again, a lot of information in there. Not all of it might be pertinent to everyone, but at the end of the guide, the last few pages has things to do 2 months before you move, 1 month before you move, 2 weeks before you move, et cetera, so that hopefully it makes the entire process a bit easier. And lastly, if you'd like to enroll in our real estate newsletter, if you already have a Columbia Uni, you can sign up. If you don't, you do have to wait until you get that. There's an archive, so you can look at all of the older issues. We do publish it once a month, sending out another one soon. Hopefully we try to cover a lot of issues. All right. So this is essentially what we're going to be covering today is what are the first things you need to think about, and this is all basically in chronological sequential order. Some of these things you might already have and know, but just in case. First thing, of course, is to determine your budget, your schedule, and exactly what it is that you need. Then you need to determine where you want or can afford, is more likely, I hate to say, to live. You need to prepare the necessary financial information and documentation. Landlords require a lot of things before they will rent to you. The New York landlords can be particularly onerous. They really just want to make sure that the rent gets paid. And since New York receives so many people, both domestically and internationally, they just want as much confirmation as possible that you are who you say you are and that you have some sort of means to be able to pay the rent. So how to search for an apartment, different ways to do that. Submitting an application. What does that mean? Signing a lease, moving in, and things to be aware of about that. And then after move-in and moving out, also some things to be aware of. Because people can sometimes get into trouble with some of the things that might happen at the end of it. Okay, so first thing, determining your budget, schedule, and needs. So apartments show up on the market, not usually more than 30 days out. So if you want to rent an apartment for August 1st, as an example, really the earliest you can start looking is July 1st. And then during the month of July, more and more apartments will show up on the market, with a lot of apartments saying immediate occupancy. Immediate occupancy does not mean that day or tomorrow. It's usually within a couple of weeks. Landlords will be a little bit negotiable about this. So that's just something to be aware of. You can only look so far out. So it's just to help to schedule your time and how, if you need a temporary place to live, for example, when you first arrived to New York, that's something to think about. The way landlords determine your budget may be different than how you determine your budget, but they would like that your gross annual income which is your pre-tax income, needs to be at least 40 times the monthly rent. And I'll explain that further as we go along. When renting an apartment from a landlord, the lease terms are a minimum of 12 months for your first year, without question. They're never negotiable about this. At least I've never seen them to be negotiable about this. Subsequent lease renewals, there can be more flexibility. Again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later too. And then rents vary considerably depending on location, size, light, amenities. There's many, many variables. Building age, apartment renovation, it's tremendous, the range. And I'll give you a couple of examples right now. So earlier today, I looked on streeteasy.com, which I have found to be probably the best websites for New York City to kind of get an idea of what's on the market at the moment and what things are costing. And StreetEasy can go into a lot of sub-neighborhoods, so certainly large, big neighborhoods, and then they can really like narrow down to sub-neighborhoods within a big neighborhood. So I just chose Morningside Heights and Washington Heights, since that's where certainly our campuses are located, or at least the majority of our people are located, those two campuses. The Studebaker campus is not going to be too dissimilar from Morningside Heights. There's actually not a lot of residential properties around Studebaker. So you're either obviously going closer to, moving up closer to Washington Heights or further down into Morningside Heights. So Morningside Heights, big range. In studios, 1,700 to 3,300 is the range currently today of listings, because there are some like high-end luxury buildings in Morningside Heights, so it kind of skews it a little bit because of that. What I saw was that you can get a pretty good apartment for about $2,400 studio. One bedrooms range from $2,000 to $4,200, and you can get a pretty decent apartment for about $2,800. Two bedrooms ranges $2,500 to $7,500, and but about when you get to about the $3,500 range, the apartments start to not be the bottom of the market anymore. It start to be a little have a little bit more character, shall we say. Okay, Washington Heights is more affordable. So Washington Heights studios are from $650 to $2,000, with about $1,800 being where some nice studios are landing. One bedrooms, $1,600 to $3,000. Again, about $2,000 or so gets you a pretty good one bedroom in Washington Heights. Two bedrooms range from $2,000 to $4,200, with $2,500 pretty much being the where you start to have some nice options. So I hope that helps to understand at least kind of where we are at this moment with rents. There are certainly other neighborhoods to consider. There are plenty of places that you can live that is still very accessible to our campuses, that can be even more affordable. And I've always liked to say I work very closely with my colleagues that help with the childcare and schooling. If anyone needs to consider public schools for their school-age children, I work very closely with my colleague about that. And there are definitely other neighborhoods that we can suggest that might offer some other public school options. Okay. Determine where you want or can afford to live. Again, what you first need to do is figure out your budget. Safety is always a concern. I've asked that a lot. New York City has become certainly much, much safer, at least statistically, over the last 10 years or so. And there are statistics that are published, but in the end, it is actually, I think, subjective. And it's just these statistics are not published per street, and that's actually ultimately what matters. The only thing I've ever seen really is about neighborhoods, and New York can vary so much from one street to the next that I don't find that to be particularly a reliable way to think about safety. It is, like I said, subjective. some people always feel safe when they probably shouldn't, and some people never feel safe when they also probably they can be safe. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, but what you perceive may or not perceive safe might be different to somebody else. But I bring this up only because I am asked it so often. Other considerations are proximity to your office or lab, of course, access to public transportation, proximity to shopping, childcare, schools, like I had mentioned before, and then of course proximity to social connections. There's so many like micro neighborhoods in New York. So if you already know people here, if you have family here, obviously that you might want to consider living closer to them. So that is always something to think about as well. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about some neighborhoods to consider, and ease also of getting to our campuses. All right, this is a very important, nice little list of the financial information and things that landlords are going to want to see. First of all, there are application fees. If you're planning to rent in a rental building, that's the lowest, those are the lowest application fees. And then co-ops and condos, you can rent an apartment in co-ops and condos as well, but the fees tend to be much higher. Since it's not just the owner of the apartment, it is the building itself that's charging these fees to look over your documentation, just to consider you as a potential tenant. Again, income requirements, I touched on that briefly before. So gross household annual salary or income must be at least 40 times the monthly rent. So in other words, if their annual income is $120,000 a year, according to landlords, you can afford rent of $3,000 a month. You might still want to pay less than that, but that's what they consider to be the maximum. Broker's fees. That is under litigation at this very moment. So it's will be a little bit in flux. If you choose to use your own broker, there will be a fee to it. Exactly how much that will end up being might change. There is some information about what it currently is in the rental guide, but those fees might change. New York State Assembly passed a law not too long ago about landlords not being able to charge fees. So we'll see where that ends up. Okay, at least signing, you need to have the first month's rent, the security deposit, and broker's fees, if they're applicable, readily available. There will be a credit check. If you already are in the United States and you have a credit history, great. If you are not, if you are moving internationally, they'll still check your credit, even if you have none, just to be sure. So that's just something to be aware of. And if you do intend to, if you're coming in internationally and do not have any credit, it is something that you should get some information about how to build it up, because all landlords, like pretty much everything that you will want to do, will probably check your credit at some point. So there are ways of creating credit here. Again, they want a lot of documents. The full list is in the rental guide. They want Columbia's offer letter. If you're already in the United States, they want to see last year's tax returns, usually just 1 year. Some have asked for 2. Sometimes they want reference letters. The list goes on. It is very dependent on the landlord as to exactly what they want to see. But it's just something that you want to have lined up before you start looking. So if you have no credit here, then lately there have been companies that have started to guarantee your rent and lease to the landlord. There is obviously a fee attached to that. The fee is not terribly high. It is a monthly fee, and it'll depend on the landlord as to which company they may have signed up with, like Insurrent, Rhino, and there are others that are coming online as well. So this is better than what it used to be. Used to be when people were coming in internationally without any credit. A lot of times landlords ask for at least 6 months of rent up front, sometimes the entire year. So that really binds you, gives you really no out of your lease at all if there's a problem. And then you have to try to get the money back from your landlord. And plus, it's an awful lot of money that you need to have up front. So this is actually much better to at least have the option through outside companies to guarantee the lease. Okay, how to search for an apartment. Like I said before, most apartments don't appear on the market until 30 days before the lease start, with immediate occupancy being pretty common. The reason for that is that in any lease, the landlord must give the tenant 24 hours notice in order to be able to show the apartment. So landlords don't want to necessarily have to arrange that. Sometimes they can't arrange it. The tenant is usually not too thrilled about having people walking through the apartment, and they might be in the middle of moving anyway. The person of the apartment might not show very well. So many landlords just wait until the previous tenant has moved out, and then they'll start showing it and list it as immediate occupancy, even if they're still painting it or doing any repairs. There are always apartments on the market 12 months of the year in New York. It doesn't matter. Even without any sort of holiday, you'll still be able to find apartments and be able to access them. The busiest time though is May through September. The summer months usually are very, very busy. There's a lot of inventory. A lot of people's leases come up in the summer and are moving. So there's a lot of listings constantly hitting the market. But there's also a lot of people looking. So you're in competition for every single apartment as well. This is also when landlords are least negotiable. So that's just something to keep in mind. Hence, being prepared is very, very important if you are coming to New York in the late spring or summer months. Okay, when you start to search for an apartment, it is best to have all your documents lined up, both in hard copy, because smaller landlords aren't set up to do everything electronically yet. But certainly large landlords are. There'll be an online application, and you can certainly upload all your documents, but it's best to have that all set up prior to even starting to look, because then you're scrambling to complete your application if you don't have it. Most landlords will not rent to you unless you've seen the apartment. I'm sure you want to see it anyway, but it's not a possibility unless you can physically come and see it. You also want to be able to scope out the neighborhood of any apartment that you're really considering. So you do want to see it and then understand exactly how that relates to any neighboring blocks. You can, like as I mentioned before, use a real estate broker. It is easiest. It saves you a lot of time and aggravation, but yes, there's a fee usually involved. The fee will vary from one apartment to the next as to what the real estate broker's fee will be, depending on if there's a broker representing the landlord or if it's a no-fee building anyway. And then you can access just plain old no-fee apartments. It is a little harder for you to search that way, but certainly not impossible. If you're new to New York, not only are you trying to acclimate yourself to neighborhoods and all that, but and you not getting any guidance from a broker, so it's a little bit more work, but certainly not impossible. If you're already in New York and you're looking to move, then it's a little bit easier, I think, because you're already physically here and you probably have more time then to be able to search for apartments and go look at apartments. Subletting, for people who do not want to take on a lease and the obligations of a lease for 12 months in particular, there is always the option of subletting an apartment. It'll be furnished. It'll probably be more expensive. You can also just rent a room in an apartment. There are 2 websites that I typically refer people to for both subletting and for renting a room. The first one is OCHA, Off-Campus Housing Assistance. It's another department within Columbia. So they have a lot of listings both for subletting and for renting a room close to our campuses. The other one is sabbaticalhomes.com. They're best for subletting. The good thing about them, it's not just Columbia centric. You can find apartments all over New York City listed there. So if there's another area that you want to live in, and again, you don't want to have to engage in a full lease with a landlord, that's a great opportunity. They don't really have rooms to rent there, though. It's mostly apartments to sublet. Okay, when you see an apartment you like, conducted your search, you looked at a few apartments, you walk into an apartment, you say, this is it, hits enough of my requirements, immediately ask to fill out an application. If it is a very good apartment with pretty good rent, it will rent quickly. So if you want to be the first person to see it, and if you're the first person to see it, while you're standing there, ask to fill out an application. And again, that's where your documents are having your documents readily accessible is going to be handy. If you don't do that, so like I said before, there's an application fee. So you only want to do it if you really like the apartment, because you will potentially be spending some money to apply. But if you don't do that and you do end up, the next day saying that was a great apartment, somebody else probably already saw it and in between that time and probably already filled out an application. So you're no longer first on the list, to be eligible for it. When you rent directly from a landlord, or you're subletting an apartment or renting a room in an apartment, it's always a good idea, particularly if you're not working with the broker. If you're working with the broker, they know the landlords usually. But it's always a good idea to do a good Google search, if nothing else, and the property and see what comes up, just to make sure, again, what you're stepping into. There are certainly scams out there. They don't hear of it too often, but they certainly exist, and that's why, particularly if you're subletting, you want to make sure that this is legitimate, because if it sounds like it's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true, like most things. So just something to be aware of. Okay, so you're renting an apartment directly from a landlord, you need to sign a lease. Lease is a contract. It is binding between you and the landlord. Of course, the most binding part of it is the rent and the term of the lease, meaning the start date and the end date of the lease. So you're saying you're going to pay rent every month for the term of the lease, and the landlord is saying that they're going to provide the apartment to you for the term of the lease, as long as you pay the rent. So only go into this if you're pretty sure that this is what you want and that you can abide by those terms. And there are also many types of lease agreements. There's just a straight old, rental agreement. There's a stabilized apartment agreement. If you're going to rent in a co-op or a condo, that's a different kind of lease and a different kind of agreement. Read it thoroughly. It's not. There are some things I've seen in leases that actually cannot be legally binding, but the law always prevails, so you don't need to worry about that as much unless there's something that's particularly egregious. If you have a pet and the lease says no pets, that needs to be clarified, even though you've told everybody that needs to know that you have a pet. You really need to change the lease, because it's signing something like that might present some problems. All right, all monies are due at lease signing. They need to be either a certified check or wire transfer. If you're transferring money from abroad, it takes longer. It is always advisable to have the money that you need here in the US. It's a much faster process. And you need, again, the first month's rent, security deposit, which is usually 1 month, and any applicable fees. You can, if you're, again, coming into the US and you don't have a bank account here, but yet you need to find an apartment to rent, there are some banks that can set you up with a bank account quickly. Most banks will not let you open a bank account if you don't already have a social security number, and that usually takes at least 2 to 3 weeks after you've arrived to get. So there's a process to that. I mean, you have to apply for it, and you have to apply for it in person with your authorized visa in hand. Columbia has an agreement, or an understanding with some lenders that can open up an account prior to you having a social security number. Diplomatic clause, I threw that in. It's not something you really can ask for on your first lease for first 12 months. I don't think too many landlords are going to accept that. But on subsequent lease renewals, if you think that it's possible that you may not stay the full 12 months for the second or third year of your lease, you can always ask to have this put in. Diplomatic clause essentially states that tenant has the right to terminate the lease with 30 days notice, written notice to the landlord. And written does not mean email. Written does mean actually sending a letter, believe it or not. And you want proof that the landlord received it. Because the landlord could always say they never received your email. The email can be changed without something different than what you had originally sent. So we're still in the old-fashioned, got to send a letter with an actual signature and getting a response back. The landlord didn't receive it. They can never say they didn't. The next thing is security deposits, and things to be aware about that, and how to get your security deposit back. Security deposits are not supposed to be used for rent. They're used to protect the landlord against any damage to the apartment. And we'll talk again, like I said, a little bit more about that. All right, move-in. You must confirm move-in requirements with the landlord of the building. Usually that's supplied to you. Most buildings only allow move-ins Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, so that the other tenants aren't disturbed with your use of the elevator or just the noise associated with the move-in. If there is a live-in super, this is also something that might be helpful. If there's a live-in super and the super is helping to coordinate your move, tipping the super might not be a bad idea because it probably will ensure better service later. If you haven't lived in the U.S. long, or or have never lived in here, yes, it's a very American thing to tip, and that's a whole other thing. But supers do not make a tremendous amount of money, and so they're very thankful when somebody tips. You don't have to tip them a lot. $20 is probably more than enough, but you actually will get a better response from the super if you understand that might be helpful. Take photos of the apartment condition when you move in. That is not typically done in New York. It is done in other countries, though, I know. But no, there's very few apartments are in perfect condition. So if there's a scratch on the kitchen countertop, definitely memorialize that. Take a photo of that. There's a scratch on the or gouge in the wood floor, definitely photograph that. I mean, just take a photos of the general condition, because in the lease will say that the apartment can have what's called normal wear and tear. And will that be considered normal wear and tear when your lease is done, even though it wasn't your fault? That's a little bit debatable. So just a good idea to understand what condition the apartment's in when you first move in. And then when you move out, you can take photos again. Again, there's little things like little holes where you hammered a picture into the wall. There's normal wear and tear. A little wearing of the floor. If you've particularly been there for a few years, is normal wear and tear. Gouges, holes, that type of thing are obviously not, and you will end up probably losing, if not most, if not all, of your security deposit because of it. Renter's insurance. It does not cost much. It's about $300 a year. You pay it on the insurance on a monthly basis. There's a very long list of companies that I have listed in the rental guide. It's not even just protecting your own goods, your own valuables in case of a fire or water damage or things like that. There's also in renter's insurance liability insurance. So if somebody is injured inside your apartment, they very well may ask for compensation for their injury, and liability insurance covers you for that. So it's usually an advisable thing to get. Apartment sharing, even if it says something different in your lease, you are allowed to have a roommate and share your apartment, certainly with your family, any family members. But if that's something you think you're going to do, you should be very upfront with your landlord in the very beginning, particularly if you now have the lease in writing that they don't want you to be able to share the apartment. You should make sure that's clear that it might be a possibility. And subletting your apartment. You are allowed to sublet your apartment as well, but again, if it's something you think you might want to do, you should make it crystal clear with your landlord before you sign that lease, because you do not want trouble later, despite whether you're allowed to do it or not. It's just going to create a problem. All right, after move-in, when you're moving out, contrary to what some people might think, there actually are a lot of tenant rights in New York, and they actually got much stronger this past June 2019. If you run into any trouble with your landlord, there's a long list of places that can help you with that. I have some of it in the rental guide. Just be aware you do have a lot of rights, but sometimes landlords like to forget that. Lease renewals, if you're in a rental building, it's usually automatic. If you're not in a rental building, if you're in a co-op or a condo, the owner might say, I'm selling the apartment, or I want to move in myself, and not renew your lease. So that's something to be aware of. In the lease renewals, like I mentioned before, the diplomatic clause, that's the time to put that in. Or if you know for sure that you're not going to be able to stay there for the entire year, you just put an earlier termination date in the lease, not the full 12 months. So that could be negotiated. Rental increases, there's a lot of regulation now about how much your landlord can charge. So that's something to be aware of as well. You can try, if you're in a market rate apartment, if you're going into market rate apartment, not any of the apartments that are under any of our rent regulated laws, you can try to get in the option to renew for a second year in your original lease with only a small increase. 3% is typical standard of living. 2 to 3% typical standard of living increase. So that's something to think about too. Changes to the apartment. It will be in your lease about not being able to paint, not being able to put up wallpaper, not being able to do certain things. Like obviously, like I said, you can hang up pictures, but any major changes you will need to clear them with your landlord. If you decide you want to repaint a room a different color, your landlord will probably charge you for bringing it back to the original color once you move out. All you need to do actually is just clear it with them if there's something you want to do. And again, get it in writing so you don't have problems later. Getting your security deposit back. So I've given you already a couple ideas of how to make sure that happens with the photos. The landlords have to return the security deposit in a timely manner. If they do not, then they have to provide proof to you as to why they're not returning your security deposit. If there was damage, they actually need to provide copies of the work that was done and how much it cost. Breaking the lease. If all of a sudden you realize you have to move for whatever the reason might be, you're in a contract with a termination date. At that point, it becomes a negotiation with your landlord to get you out of it. And most larger landlords will certainly have some policies as to what they expect. Smaller landlords might be more negotiable about it. Really will depend. It is unusual for a landlord to pursue the full rent for the lease term. Most landlords will keep your security deposit as a minimum if you decide you need to break the lease early without having a diplomatic clause in there. So that's just something to be aware of. Things happen in life, you never know. Had all the best intentions, but okay. Resources, there's a lot of resources in our rental guide, and so I just listed kind of what they are. They're all the links that are in earlier part, in other parts of the guide. One thing I didn't talk about is, and so just reminded me about rental furniture. When you lease an apartment in New York City, again, if you're coming in internationally, there are very, very few apartments that are rented furnished. There are apartments that can be rented furnished. They're usually very, very high cost. There's a definite premium attached to that. But apartments, when you rent directly from a landlord, are vacant, and they're unfurnished. However, they will have full kitchen cabinetry, kitchen appliances, the major kitchen appliances, and anything else in the apartment that's affixed to a wall or a ceiling, like fixtures or sconces. Because I know in other countries that's not the case. You actually have to supply all of that, or most of it anyway, yourself. So that's just something to be aware of. It's still less expensive to furnish your apartment yourself than to try to rent a furnished apartment, unless you're subletting directly. Subletting apartments usually are furnished. However, you have very little negotiability with the time that you have that. So if you're here for a couple of years and you don't want to have to move, then still renting from a landlord and then furnishing yourself is probably the best and probably least expensive option. There are certainly many ways of furnishing an apartment inexpensively. Questions? All right, I think I'm gonna get out of this. And that's like worklife.columbia.edu again. All right. Does anybody have any questions? If you want to turn your mics on, I'm happy to answer anything. I hope that was all somewhat understandable. No questions?
You can discuss, do you still need a personal guarantor if you make enough, like more than 40 times the rent?
You shouldn't need a personal guarantor at that point. Now, if you have no credit history here, landlords have done that. Either they asked for many months of rent up front, at least 6, sometimes the full 12, or if you have have somebody co-sign the lease with you. So the person that co-signs the lease with you, an access guarantor, needs to make 80 times the monthly rent as their gross annual income, and they need to provide documentation of that. And it has to be somebody who's obviously here, either as a citizen or a permanent resident that can act as guarantor. So that's a little bit more difficult for people. Usually, obviously, the only people that are going to do that are family members that you might have here. But I think that with this new trend towards Insurrent and Rhino, where an outside company can guarantee the lease, that seems to me that that's a good and viable option of avoiding all of that.
And
anything else?
And what about taking over somebody's lease for?
Okay, particularly if they're breaking it. There are websites that people list things that they're breaking their lease. Again, it's very individual with the landlord. So you can take over people's leases. I mean, particularly if they're breaking the lease, that's actually a good way for them to get out of it. And the landlord says, sure, okay, you found me another, a tenant to take it over and to continue it. You will probably then have a new lease that's in your name. And the landlord will still ask for an application and all verification of everything, just like any other situation. Otherwise, the person is subletting to you. If the lease stays in place, and you're not really taking it over, you'll end up really actually subletting it. And the landlord needs to agree to that. Even though tenants, under most circumstances, have the right to sublet, it's never a good idea not to get one's landlord know about it and in the process only because, again, you can have trouble later. Trying to, if they're unhappy, it's not usually, that doesn't turn out too well. Any other questions?
Ali, maybe you can mention the law about subletting in New York City.
So again, it depends on what kind of lease you have. If you're renting in a condo or a co-op, you're less able to sublet, only because the condo and the co-op are so very involved in who you are and getting you in. Because technically, you're already subletting, technically, from the owner. So those are a little bit more difficult. If you have a straight rental apartment, and certainly if you have a rental apartment that's under rent stabilization, you do have the ability to sublet it under certain circumstances. It can't be more than 6 months, I think, because it still has to be the original leaseholder, the original tenant, still needs to be their primary residence, and primary residence is considered that you're living there 6 months and 1 day. So you can only sublet it for a certain period of time anyway. So again, sometimes it's not, if you want to be in the same spot for 2 years or a year, it's still advisable to rent directly from the landlord, because that'll give you the most security in that regard. Anything else that I can answer, or at this point? I'm available at any point, at any time in this process.
I have a question. What type of credit check do landlords do?
So they do an internal to the US credit check. There's 3 credit agencies that report in. You get it, once you have a credit history, you will have a score attached to your credit history. And there's also a record of how you pay your bills, how you credit card debt, and how you pay off credit cards. There's a lot of things that go into how that score is tabulated. But the most important thing is that you pay your bills on time.
I've had the issue. I've been in the US for like 1.5 years, more or less. And I essentially have had a credit card for all the time.
Great.
My credit card gives me a credit score.
Right.
FICO credit score.
But
I tried getting the full report from one of the agencies, and I couldn't. Because
you have to request
we don't have your information, you don't exist. Yeah, and so I myself cannot get my own record. So I'm concerned that if someone checks and they have the same issue, they're going to be like, oh, this person is like lying or whatever.
Okay. Actually, would you mind doing me a favor? Would you mind emailing me with what your issue is? Because there's a way of you to, first of all, see exactly what's on your credit report and then fix it. So if you don't mind sending me an email, and I'll definitely respond to you about how you can go about doing this, because there is definitely erroneous information on people's credit histories and credit reports. It's always a good idea to test, to check your credit score regularly, just to be sure. So I'll send you some more information about that. I'm not exactly a credit expert here, so but I do know that there are a lot of things that show up erroneously. The electric company says that you paid your bill late, and it shows up on your, even though you didn't, but it shows up on your credit report, and then of course adversely affects that score. But you can fix it. It can take a little time. It can take a couple months. So dealing with some bureaucracy there, but it's always a good idea to know what's going on, what's being reported.
Okay, great.
Anything else?
If you live with a spouse or something like that, does your income count together for this 40 times requirement?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the household annual income.
And in that case, do they have to co-sign the lease?
I believe so. And all occupants should be listed on the lease anyway. So certainly whoever is occupying the apartment, if it's 2 adults, they're usually both and are both responsible for the payment of the rent, then yes, they would both be on the lease. If you have children, then they're usually listed on the lease as well as occupants. Or if you have a parent that visits frequently, they should be listed as an occupant as well, just so there aren't any problems later. So both people really do need to be on the lease. I mean, it makes sense. Landlords want to know who are in the apartment, who have the right to be in the apartment. And it's always a good idea to be as upfront as possible with all of that.
What about in a scenario whereby you are offered an apartment by Columbia? You have to follow the same procedure?
So I have nothing to do with Columbia Apartments. I probably stipulated that. But they have their own rules and regulations. It's actually on their website.
I do live in Columbia Housing. I can tell you there's none of all this.
No, there isn't. There isn't. It's true.
I only had to produce the security deposit and the first month's rent.
Right.
And that's it. They know you're working for them. So
exactly. They know how to find you.
Definitely do not ask.
And they know how much you make.
They don't ask for the 40 times. And
no.
I know that because I pay more than that. So.
Right. No, it's much easier. I mean, Columbia are great landlords. Let's put it that way. But not everybody's eligible. And you can lose your eligibility too, depending on if you switch positions within the university. Yeah. There's no guarantee. So as postdocs, there are a certain amount of postdoc apartments in Columbia Housing. If your postdoc situation changes, but you then become an officer of administration, for example, or even an officer of research, you may not be eligible anymore for a Columbia apartment. So that's just something to be aware of too. Or yeah. But I have nothing to do with Columbia Residential. I just know too much about it too. Anything else?
Do you need do you need to, are there any specific criteria to be eligible for a rent stabilized or rent control apartment?
So rent controlled, you basically have to live with the person for 2 years to then be able to take over a rent control apartment. Unless you're over, I think it's the age of 62, which I don't think you are. So, so they're essentially impossible to get unless you have a family member that you move in with, and then you're eligible to continue to live there and keep that very low rent usually. Rent stabilized apartments, you can move into a rent stabilized apartment and have a rent stabilized lease. They don't show up on the market too often, but they do show up. Nobody is probably it's going to be difficult to sometimes confirm that it's a rent stabilized lease until you're about to sign it. And then it should say rent stabilized lease. There are ways of finding out if it's a rent stabilized building. The rent itself will probably indicate if it's rent stabilized or not, because I think that it's now apartments stay under rent stabilization up to $2,700. It's very difficult now with the new rent laws as of June 2019 for landlords to take apartments out of rent stabilization. It was pretty easy for them to do it before, and it's much more difficult for them to do it now. So actually there might be some more opportunities there to find it. So rent stabilized leases are great to have because the increases to the rent are very controlled. And there's always a debate every year as to what the percentage is going to be. And of course, landlords want as much as they want, and tenants want 0. There have been 0% increases in rent stabilized leases in the past few years, and very low increases otherwise. So they're not necessarily as easy to find, as I had said, but they're definitely available, definitely out there. Any other questions?
Does your office have any information on the housing lottery for New York City? I don't know the official name.
Yes, I think it is called housing lottery, actually. So the apartments that show up, you can apply directly to them. That's from what I have heard, that for people that have applied, it takes a long time sometimes for your kind of name to come up. So it's not always a good idea to register with it anyway, and to directly apply to buildings as they come up. If my understanding is that if you register and you're eligible for something based on your income, because each building has a different income cap. Actually, they have a minimum too. They have a minimum and a maximum, and each building's a little bit different. Household size also qualifies you for certain size apartments. My understanding is that it takes a long time sometimes before you actually get a call, and it's not always, it just takes a while. It's not so easy to get. Sometimes you don't want the apartment that they might actually ask if you want to apply for it or not. So it's certainly something worth trying, but no, certainly no guarantee that you're going to get the apartment you want. And also, it's supposed to be affordable rent. Some of the rents don't look that affordable to me, quite honestly. So they're affordable as far as New York is concerned, but this still might not necessarily be as affordable as what we really would want. I hope that helps. I don't know if that was a good, complete answer, but anything else? Anyone else? No? Well, I want to thank Yanir for setting this up. And I'm happy to do it again, at maybe for the few months from now, when our life is settled down a little bit. And I'm always available for any questions that anybody might have at any point anyway. So, I'm always happy to help people and get people settled. And certainly people that are relocating into New York, if all of you already have done it, then you know that it's not such an easy thing to do. And that's why my department, first of all, exists, and my particular service. It can all be a little disconcerting. So
I think someone asked if you could provide your contact information.
Sure, I think it was it's in the slides here, but I'll just give it to you. So my email is al2775@columbia.edu. That's usually the best way to contact me, because I respond right away. Sometimes having a conversation is easier than email, depending on what your question is, and then I will probably follow up with an email after our conversation. But reaching out to me by email first is probably the easiest way.
I guess we'll be in touch with you for the slides, and we'll edit this recording.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, if you don't mind sending the recording to me too.
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah.
We're probably going to post it on our website as well. So.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you. Bye.
Stay well.
Bye.
Stay healthy.